English Literature Studies.
Welcome back to English Literature Studies. In this video, we are going to study objective poetry. As in our last video, we discussed subjective poetry. Also, we discussed it all depends on the handling of the subject matter of the poetry by the poet. It all depends on the handling of the subject, how the poet is handling the subject. If the poet is handling the subject with his emotions, feelings, then that is subjective poetry. However, objective poetry is an impersonal poetry. Let's look at what is objective poetry in detail. The objective poetry is older than subjective poetry. In ancient times, people used to record their stories of bravery, bloodshed, battlefield, sacrifice, wisdom, everything. They used to record everything in the form of oral literature, and they used to sing those stories in streets and open places. With the time passage, after learning alphabets, they started writing objective poetry, and that form of poetry was objective poetry. However, the subjective poetry was not form of the poetry in ancient times. Objective poetry is the origin of the poetry. The objective poetry is based on facts. So, what is objective poetry? The subject matter of objective poetry deals with the observations, experiences around the poet, rather than involving his own emotions and feelings. In objective poetry, the poet excludes his feelings from the writing, from the art of writing. He excludes himself. Instead, he describes the experiences, the observations around him, the behavior of the people around him, the behavior of the environment, the facts, the people around him, the facts around him, rather than putting his own feelings, emotions, his personal statements. He detaches himself from the subject. However, he treats the subject objectively. He excludes himself, his ideas, his emotions, his point of view, his opinion about a certain thing, and describes the environment, the surrounding. In objective poetry, he values the observations. He values the observations or experiences made by his ear and eye. One of the very fine examples of objective poetry is Reliques of Ancient English Poetry, written by Thomas Percy, and it was published in 1765. Now let's look at the forms of objective poetry. Ballad, epic. Ballad is an impersonal poem meant for singing. Now these are the very short descriptions, brief descriptions of these both kinds of objective poetry. However, we will deeply study these both types of objective poetry in detail in a separate video. So for now, ballad is an impersonal poem. As objective poetry is all about impersonal writing, it is meant for singing. On the other hand, epic is long narrative poem, and the subject of these poems is heroic achievements. So this is all about objective poetry. In simple words, we can say that objective poetry is based on facts. However, subjective poetry is based on opinions, personal opinions of the writer, personal thoughts of the writer. And in objective poetry, objective of the writer is to describe his surroundings. Poetry revolves around the thoughts of the society, the facts of the society. So the objective poetry is inspired by the outer world. The passions, actions, everything has nothing to do with the writer, but with the environment and the society, the people around him, the surrounding. Also, the objective poetry was the earlier times of poetry that was established in the earlier times. Since the ancient times, it has the origin since the people started writing literature, started preserving literature. On the other hand, subjective poetry came into being with the progress of time, with the progress of literature, the development of the thoughts. This is all about objective poetry in this video. Also, we will be discussing the kinds of subjective poetry and objective poetry in separate video in the upcoming series. So stay tuned and keep watching English Literature Studies. Thank you.